A gunshot does not care who you are. On the night of March 2nd, 2023, two men rode a motorbike through the streets of Rosario, Argentina. They stopped outside a small supermarket. The shop belonged to the family of a woman named Antonella. Her husband was, at that exact moment, the most famous man on the planet. Weeks earlier, he had lifted the World Cup in Qatar. He had done what no Argentine had done in 36 years. He had carried a nation on his back and set it down gently, whole, triumphant, on the other side of history. The two men did not care about any of that. They raised their weapons. They fired 14 shots into the front door of the shop. Glass shattered. The bullets tore through metal and wood. No one was inside. No one was hurt. But before the men sped off into the dark, one of them left something behind, a piece of cardboard. Scrawled across it, in the ugly handwriting of a warning, were 5 words: Messi, we are waiting for you, somewhere far away. In a house that felt too big and too quiet, a man watched the footage of his family's shop on the news. He said nothing in public. He did not go home for a long time after that. And the question that hung over Argentina, over football, over every fan who had cried with him just months earlier, was simple and impossible at once. How does the greatest player in the history of the game become a hostage in his own hometown? To understand that message on the cardboard, you have to go back, not to Doha, not to Barcelona. You have to go back to the beginning, to the dust and the concrete of a neighborhood called Las Heras, on the south side of Rosario, where a small boy first touched a ball and where, decades later, the city that made him would send him a warning written in gunfire. This is not a story about football. This is a story about roots. And what happens when the ground beneath them turns rotten? Rosario is Argentina's third largest city, sitting on the western bank of the Paraná River. For most of the 20th century, it was known for grain, for industry, for a certain hard-edged pride. It gave the world Che Guevara. It gave the world tango legends and poets. And in the summer of 1987, in a modest house not far from a steel factory, it gave the world a boy who could barely be seen over the dashboard of his father's car, a boy whose feet, according to family legend, would not stop moving even in his sleep. Leo grew up the way most kids in Las Heras grew up. Concrete street games, cousins as teammates, a grandmother named Celia, who dragged him to his first practice at Grandoli, the local club, when he was barely 5 years old, too small for the team roster. So the coach let him play anyway, because nobody could bear to leave him on the bench. He belonged to that street before he belonged to anyone else. The city was in his blood before the fame was. But something else was in his blood too. At 11 years old, a doctor delivered news that would have ended most stories before they began. Leo had a growth hormone deficiency. Without expensive treatment, doctors were not certain he would grow past the height of a child. His family could not afford it. For a while, a local club paid for part of it. Then that funding dried up too. The boy who would become the greatest goal scorer in the history of the sport was, for a moment, simply a small, sick child in a city that did not have the money to save him. Rosario could not keep him, not because it didn't love him, because it couldn't afford to. That absence, that inability, is the first fracture in this story. It would not be the last. In 2000, a scout for FC Barcelona watched Leo play in a trial match. What he saw made him desperate. Barcelona's youth academy agreed to pay for his medical treatment and offered his family passage to Spain. There was no time for lengthy paperwork. Legend says the club's sporting director grabbed the nearest piece of paper, a paper napkin from a cafe table, and wrote the terms of the agreement on it right there, because he was afraid that if he waited even one more day, someone else would take the boy first. At 13 years old, Leo Messi left Rosario. He left the streets of Las Heras, the family, the grandmother who had died just before he departed, the accent, the asado on Sundays, the only city he had ever known. He carried a suitcase and a needle in his thigh, because even in Barcelona, the growth hormone injections continued for years. He cried, according to people who knew him then, more nights than anyone realized. Rosario had given him his first touch of a ball. Rosario, in the same breath, could not give him what he needed to survive. Barcelona could. This is the wound underneath everything that follows. Rosario is home. Rosario is also the place that let him go. He became, in Spain, something the world had never quite seen, a player built less like an athlete and more like a phenomenon of physics, low to the ground, impossible to dispossess, capable of turning a football pitch into something closer to a dream sequence. Ballon d'Or after Ballon d'Or, 91 goals in a single calendar year, a record that may never be touched. Barcelona's greatest era, in many ways, was simply the era of Leo Messi deciding, night after night, that the impossible was administrative rather than physical, and yet every summer he came home, not to Barcelona's beaches, to Rosario, to the same streets, the same family gatherings, the same low-key affection of a city that, unlike much of the world, refused to treat him like a god. In Rosario, for a few weeks a year, he could just be Leo, not Messi the phenomenon. Leo, the guy from Las Heras, eating dinner with his cousins. That duality, global icon and local kid, was always fragile, and in the years after he lifted the World Cup, the fragility cracked wide open. Here is the part of the story that most highlight reels skip. While Leo Messi was becoming a legend on the other side of the ocean, Rosario itself was falling apart, beginning in the 2010s and accelerating brutally through the early 2020s. Rosario transformed. The city that gave Argentina poets and revolutionaries became, statistically, one of the most violent cities in the country, at times cited among the most dangerous in the world, outside of active war zones. Drug trafficking organizations, fighting for control of cocaine routes running out through the port on the Paraná River, turned entire neighborhoods into contested territory. Assassinations became almost routine. In a single recent year, the city recorded close to 300 homicides, a number that, for a city of Rosario's size, is staggering. This was not the Rosario of Leo's childhood. The street where he learned to dribble a ball between cousins had become, in parts, a place where children learned instead to recognize the sound of gunfire and know which way to run. The gangs did not choose Rosario by accident. It sits on a river that leads to the Atlantic. It is a perfect artery for moving product out to Europe. And as the cartels tightened their grip on the city, they discovered something else about their hometown, something almost mythological in its power. Leo Messi's name meant something. It could be used. In the months and years leading up to that night in March 2023, threats against Messi's family had already been simmering beneath the surface. There had been intimidation before, quieter, less publicized. But the shooting at the supermarket was different. It was public. It was theatrical. 14 bullets is not a message you send by accident. It is a message you send when you want the entire country watching. Investigators later suggested The attack may have been connected to a local gang leader, someone who wanted attention, who wanted the story of Rosario's violence to be attached, however grotesquely, to the most famous name the city had ever produced. Using Messi's name did something crude but effective. It guaranteed headlines. It guaranteed that the eyes of Argentina and much of the world would turn toward Rosario's crisis in a way that years of quiet suffering by ordinary residents never could, which raises the darkest irony sitting at the heart of this story. The child that Rosario could not afford to save became, decades later, a hostage of a crisis Rosario could not afford to control. He wasn't targeted because of who he was to the criminals. He was targeted because of what his name could do for them. Think about the timing. 3 months. That is all the distance between the peak of his career and this humiliation. In December, he had held the World Cup above his head in Lusail, crying, the golden trophy pressed to his lips like something sacred. He had done, at last, the one thing that had eluded him across a decade and a half of near misses, penalty heartbreaks, and public tears. He had won it all. There was, by any reasonable measure, nothing left to prove. And then, in March, his wife's family business had its front door shredded by gunfire, and a piece of cardboard told him his own city was waiting for him. There is a particular kind of grief in that juxtaposition. It's not the grief of losing. Leo Messi had spent his whole career learning how to survive losing. 4 major finals lost before that redemption, a public retirement, and a public reversal. Tears in stadiums from New Jersey to Barcelona. He knew how to carry defeat. What he did not have a script for was this: winning everything and still not being safe in the one place that was supposed to be safe by definition. Home. For weeks afterward, he said almost nothing publicly. Teammates and people close to him described a man who was shaken in a way that trophies and failures never seemed to shake him. This was not a missed penalty. This was not a lost final. A missed penalty ends when the whistle blows. A threat like this does not end. It sits, quietly, in the background of every visit home, every family dinner, every quiet walk down a street he used to know by heart. He stopped visiting Rosario as freely as he once had for a man whose entire emotional architecture had always included this specific act, going home, disappearing into the ordinary rhythms of his old neighborhood. That absence mattered. It wasn't just about physical safety. It was about losing the one place in the world where he had never needed to be messy, where he could just be Leo. City officials, business leaders, and ordinary residents in Rosario reacted with a mixture of shame and desperation. Local authorities condemned the attack. Community leaders spoke about how painful it was that the city's most beloved son had been used as a pawn in a war most of Rosario's people never asked for and could not escape. Some pleaded publicly for him to return, arguing that his presence, his visibility, could shine a light on the city's suffering rather than abandon it to its worst headlines. Others understood, with a kind of resigned sadness, why he might choose to stay away. There is no clean resolution to this chapter. Leo Messi did not fix Rosario. No single person could. The drug war that consumes parts of the city continues. A slow bleeding wound on a place that once produced revolutionaries and poets, and now too often produces funerals. He has, at times, quietly and without spectacle, engaged in supporting causes and charitable efforts. connected to Argentina and to children in need, echoes perhaps of the boy who once needed help himself and did not always receive it in time. But the relationship between the man and the city that made him has never fully returned to what it once was. And maybe that is the truest, hardest part of this story. Not every wound closes. Not every threat resolves into a triumphant third act. Sometimes the place that shaped you becomes a place you can only love from a careful distance. The way you might love a memory you're afraid to revisit because reality has changed too much since. Consider the full arc for a moment. A boy nearly lost to a hormone deficiency his hometown could not afford to treat. A teenager who left everything he knew at 13 because leaving was the only way to survive. A man who spent 21 years building a home in a foreign country only to be told, eventually, that even that home had limits. A player who cried on a stadium pitch in Qatar, finally whole, finally complete, only to be reminded 3 months later that the place his story began was no longer entirely his to walk through freely. There's a phrase people use about Rosario now, spoken half in pride and half in grief. They call it la cuna y la herida, the cradle and the wound, the place that rocked him to sleep as an infant, and the place that, decades later, fired 14 bullets into a door and left his name written on cardboard as a threat. Leo Messi gave Rosario something no city gets twice in a century, a son whose feet turned it, for a while, into the most famous street corner in football history. Rosario gave him back something more complicated, not just talent, not just an origin story for the highlight reels, but the deepest lesson of his whole career, learned far from any pitch. That greatness does not buy safety, that the place you love most can also be the place that hurts you in ways trophies cannot heal. He still carries Rosario with him in his accent, unchanged, after 25 years in Europe and America, in the tattoos on his body, some of them tributes to the city and the family that raised him. In the way, teammates say, he still talks about home with a softness he doesn't extend to almost anything else in football. But carrying a place and being able to walk its streets freely are not the same thing. And somewhere in that gap between memory and reality is where this particular story of Leo Messi actually lives. Not in the 6 Ballons d'Or, not in the World Cup lifted under the lights of Lusail, in a quiet, unresolved ache for a hometown that loved him first and hurt him worst, and a man who, even now, is still trying to figure out how to hold both of those truths in the same hand. The machine, as people love to call him, never stopped scoring. But even machines, it turns out, have a place they call home. And sometimes, home is the one opponent that never gives you a clean result.